diplomatic circles. I thank you all for joining us today. Ladies and gentlemen, before I invite today's guest speaker, may I invite Ambassador Azaz Ahmad Chaudhry, Director General Institute of Strategic Studies, Islamabad, for his welcome remarks. Ambassador Azaz Ahmad Chaudhry has served as member of Foreign Service of Pakistan for 37 years. Ambassador Chaudhry's last diplomatic assignment was as Ambassador of Pakistan to United States of America. He has also served as Ambassador of Pakistan to Netherlands, Foreign Office spokesman, and Deputy Permanent Representative of Pakistan to United States in New York. Ambassador Chaudhry.
Thank you very much. Very warm welcome to this institute. This institute is a premier institute of Islamabad. We were founded about 49 years ago in 1973. And we focus on strategic issues, but for focused work we have 5 centers of excellence. One center works on China-Pakistan Study Center, the other on India, the third one on Afghanistan, Middle East and Africa, and the fourth one is Center for Strategic Perspectives, which is your host today, which looks after our relations with Europe, US, Russia, and also on some of the non-traditional security areas like climate change and food security and even human rights. Then we also have another center, Arms Control and Disarmament. Human rights is one subject on which I think every Pakistani is increasingly becoming conscious of the need for us to really work on. In the last decade or so, we did make some progress in signing up to several conventions, UN and international conventions, but I believe that there is still a lot that we need to do. Not because we want to just fulfill the obligations that we have towards these international conventions, but more so because the people of Pakistan really deserve that. And every democratic government, I think the test of every democratic government is that if they are able to lay greater emphasis on human rights, then they are really serving the true purpose and spirit of democracy. So we are thankful to you that you are coming here, and we are all very keen to listen to you, what your perspective is, the European Union's perspective is, and how is it that you see the situation in Pakistan, and what is it that we can... The program I have explained to you, after your talk will sit here and we'll have a brief question-answer session after that. Please, you are most welcome to come. Introduction. She wanted to read your profile.
Just a brief profile.
Oh, sorry. It's the embarrassing bit.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, our guest speaker for today is Mr. Eamon Gilmore, who is European Union Special Representative for Human Rights since 2019 and has also served as EU Special Envoy for Colombian Peace Process since October 2015. Mr. Gilmore has also served as Ireland Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade from 2011 and 14. As Minister for Foreign Trade, Mr. Gilmore managed the Northern Ireland peace process on behalf of the Irish government. Mr. Gilmore has also been campaigner for peace and has been honored with awards for his leading role in promotion of human rights. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mr. Eamon Gilmore for his public talk. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much for your warm introduction. Thank you, Ambassador Chaudhry, for the invitation to be here. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is an honour to be with you, an honour to be here in the Institute of Strategic Studies, and I know you're in partnership with the Centre for Strategic Perspectives in this lecture today, and I want to thank all of you for organising it and for doing me the honour of asking me to speak to you. I also want to acknowledge the presence here of my good friend, Ambassador Andrew Caminara, who has been instrumental in getting me to come to Pakistan. It's a visit that I have wanted to do really since the very beginning of my mandate in 2019, but a combination of COVID and other circumstances have prevented from happening until now. As I came here, I was reflecting on the fact that it is 60 years this year since the establishment of formal diplomatic relations between Pakistan and the European Union. Indeed, the diplomatic relationship with Pakistan is one of the European Union's longest and most valued. 1962. 1962 was only 5 years after the Treaty of Rome, which established the European Economic Community, which was the forerunner of the current European Union. And it was only 12 years after the very idea of a European Union, of whatever kind. The precise term wasn't used in the document, but the very idea of a union of European countries was proclaimed in the Schuman Declaration on the 10th of May 1950. The great French diplomat Robert Schuman made the modest proposal to establish a common authority, essentially between France and Germany, for the production of coal and steel. And we need to think about the context in which that proposal was made, and the purpose for which it was made. The purpose for which it was made was, firstly, to bring together two protagonists in the Second World War, but it was also with the idea that if you could establish a common authority for coal and steel, you would make it materially impossible for those countries to go to war again. And that context, just after the end of the Second World War, in which France, Germany and other European countries fought each other in the most bloody conflicts in history, in which we saw the worst genocide, the Holocaust, in all of humankind, in which we saw the greatest slaughter of civilians in any war that had taken place, which had engulfed the world, and which of course was eventually brought to an end in the horrific heat of nuclear bombs in Japan. So to truly understand what motivates the European Union and its foreign policy, and in particular what motivates its human rights policy, we need to take ourselves back to that moment in history, when people everywhere throughout the world, having absorbed the horror of what happened during not just that war, but the preceding First World War, and were seeking an answer to the question of how do we prevent this from happening again? How do we prevent wars of any kind, but certainly wars of that scale? And not just prevent the wars, but prevent the hatred and the circumstances and the phobias which led to those wars breaking out in the first place. And from that reflection and that thinking which took place, we got, of course, the United Nations. We got the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the 75th anniversary of which we will celebrate next year. And we got the idea of European states coming together to work together initially modestly. And that idea of coal and steel, coming together on coal and steel production, eventually developed into an idea, well, if we can cooperate on coal and steel, maybe we can cooperate on other things, agriculture, fisheries, and some other areas of trade. So the concept of the European Economic Community, or the common market, which was known commonly emerged, later evolved into a single market with free movement of goods and people and services throughout the countries that were a part to it. Eventually an economic and monetary union, a single currency, the euro, which is now adopted by most states, the idea of a political union to embrace the countries coming out of communist dictatorships in the early 1990s, the very development of what we now know today as the European Union, with its own common foreign and security policy. And as that process continued and deepened, it of course also grew. First there were 6, then there were 9, then there were 12, 15, and eventually 27. I was going to say 28, but it's 27. And when we think about it, it's a unique form of international cooperation in the world, and international governance and international law, that 27 independent states, different histories, different traditions, different languages. Big states like France, Germany and Poland. Small states like Malta, Cyprus. Medium-sized states like my own state of Ireland, Finland. Some of whom were democracies like my own independence in 1922. Some of whom suffered under fascism like Spain, Portugal and Greece. And several of whom have been communist dictatorships like Poland, Czech Republic and Hungary. And are all now together in one union, the European Union. And what binds that union together are its treaties. And these treaties in turn are approved either by the parliaments of each of its member states, or in some cases by the universal suffrage of its citizens in a referendum to approve the treaties and the various amendments to them. And when we look at the treaties, I think it's instructive that it tells us what this union is about. The Treaty on the European Union, right at the very beginning, in Article 2, just after the article which says there shall be a European Union. I'm not sure if I'm quoting Article 1 correctly, but after the title, it says the following. The Union is founded on the values of respect for human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, the rule of law, and respect for human rights, including the rights of persons belonging to minorities. These values are common to the member states in a society in which pluralism, non-discrimination, tolerance, justice, solidarity, and equality between women and men prevail. That's not just a statement of objective. It's also a condition for membership of the European Union. And it is also a condition that member states not only observe these standards and these values, democracy, rule of law and human rights, in the conduct of their business, but that they also agree to promote them in the wider world. So from the very outset, human rights are central to the entire European Union project, and therefore it is no surprise that they should be reflected in the foreign policy of the European Union and in all of the major strategic documents which set out that policy. Before I get into the detail of what the centrality of human rights in our foreign policy means, I want to say one or two words about our foreign policy. Because the common foreign and security policy of the European Union, and indeed the common security and defence policy of the European Union, is something that has taken some time to develop. First of all, again, it is unique that 27 independent sovereign countries would agree to pool their foreign policy effectively, and have agreed to pool it in a unique way within the way in which we make decisions in the European Union. Because decision-making on foreign and security policy is one of the few areas in the European Union which is decided by unanimity. So to get a policy, all 27 must agree. It's challenging. Sometimes it doesn't happen. Sometimes from the perspective of those of us who work for the system, it is frustrating that there is a statement or a position that we think should be clearly made, and it's not possible to get unanimity on it. But the remarkable thing is that it does succeed. The remarkable thing is that 27 countries, so different in many ways, can come together and say we have a common position on fundamental issues and fundamental directions in the world. And I think we've seen an example of that even in recent days, in the unity that was achieved in the foreign policy of the European Union in relation to the Russian aggression in Ukraine. The second thing that I would say about the foreign policy is that it is relatively new. The chief, as he's called, of our foreign policy service, the High Representative and Vice President of the European Union, currently Josep Borrell of Spain, is actually only the third holder of that office. And the first holder of it was appointed to it only 13 years ago. That was Catherine Ashton of the United Kingdom. And the European External Action Service, which sometimes described as the foreign ministry of the European Union, or the State Department of the European Union, depending on which side of the Atlantic you're looking at it from. The European External Action Service is only 10 years old, just over 10 years old. So the actual operation of a foreign policy by the European Union, this combined foreign policy, is relatively new. And the third thing that I would say about it is that the foreign policy of the European Union is an independent foreign policy. It is a foreign policy that is decided by the governments, foreign ministers of the 27 member states meeting together in the Foreign Affairs Council. And you will probably have seen in statements that have been made by High Representative Borrell in recent times that we are re-emphasising the independence of the European Union's foreign policy. It's not a foreign, we don't have a foreign policy that is borrowed from any other power or any other country in the world. We don't have a foreign policy that is against particular powers or countries in the world. We have an independent foreign policy which we pursue strategically, and we are developing what we call strategic autonomy, the strategic compass, an independent approach to Europe's, the EU's place in today's world. So where does the human rights dimension fit into that? Well, first of all, we tend to articulate policies. If 27 countries try to agree something, you always have to get it down on paper. So we are very good at producing plans and documents and strategies. And this is my Bible. This is the document that I follow with regard to our human rights policy. It is the European Union's action plan on human rights and democracy in the world for period 2020 to 2024. That document, which is our roadmap, was agreed unanimously by all of the 27 member states in November of 2020. It is a comprehensive statement of the European Union's human rights policies and objectives, and it is actually the only one of its kind, the only comprehensive statement of this kind of any regional organisation in the world. It's built on 5 pillars. Firstly, the protecting and empowering of individuals. Secondly, building of resilient, inclusive and democratic societies. Thirdly, the promotion of a global system for human rights and democracy. Fourth, new technologies. The harnessing of the opportunities and addressing the challenges. And indeed, I've just come from a meeting with your President where in fact one of the topics we discussed was that issue of the necessity to address new technology and the many issues which arise from a human rights perspective. And the 5th pillar of this policy document is delivering by working together, because no individual country, no group of countries can deliver what are universal rights and objectives. These objectives we pursue consistently and everywhere across the world. And we give effect to this document by what we call individual country strategies. The European Union is represented now in over 140 countries around the world, headed by delegations, headed by a head of delegation like Ambassador Kamanara, working with the embassies of our member states, and in each of these countries we develop what we call a country strategy, which is developed between the European Union delegation and the member states of our embassies. That's done in consultation with civil society organisations and with our interlocutors in the different countries. Inevitably, that strategy differs from country to country because the human rights issues and priorities in different countries vary. We then give effect to that in every formal agreement that we have with countries outside of the European Union. So in countries, for example, where we have different kinds of political and association agreements, in all of them, there is a human rights clause or a human rights provision which requires us to have an engagement with that country on human rights issues. Big, small countries we are very friendly with, countries sometimes we have difficulties with. So for example, later in March, I will go to Washington to co-chair with my counterpart in the State Department the annual United States-European Union human rights consultations. We will talk, of course, about human rights situations in many different parts of the world, but we will also talk, sometimes uncomfortably, about human rights issues in our respective countries. I will no doubt raise issues relating to the death penalty in the United States, issues relating to the outfall of recent protests in the United States. The United States will inevitably raise with me issues relating to protests in member states, some issues, rule of law issues in some individual member states, and issues perhaps relating to migration. Every trade agreement that we have, and we have many of them around the world, we have human rights clauses in those trade agreements. And it doesn't matter what country it is. When I was the Foreign Minister of Ireland, I had the honour of being Foreign Minister and leading the rotating presidency of the European Union on behalf of Ireland in 2013. And one of the issues which was on our agenda at that time was the free trade agreement with Canada. And the free trade discussions on the free trade agreement with Canada was held up. And it was held up because Canada just couldn't understand why the European Union was insisting on a human rights clause in their trade agreement. And they made it very clear to us, and I travelled, by the way, at that time. I spent St. Patrick's Day in Canada that particular year, talking about this issue, because they couldn't understand why Canada, which is one of the best human rights records in the world, should be told about human rights by countries that have recently come out of communist dictatorships. And it took some time for us to persuade Canada that we insist on having a human rights clause in all our engagements with every country in the world. We have, in relation to our trade relationships, we have schemes of what we call trade preferences in different countries. And these are mechanisms by which duty-free or tariff-free access is given to countries for access to the European Union market. One of the beneficiaries of that system of trade preferences is Pakistan. Pakistan enjoys a status called GSP+. If anybody has a question to explain what GSP Plus is, I'll ask the ambassador to answer it. But it's called GSP Plus, and basically it gives to Pakistan access to the European market. And in fact, Pakistan is one of the biggest beneficiaries of the GSP Plus trade preferences, and particularly in the area of textiles. And we talk, and part of the discussions that I have this week with representatives of the government of Pakistan relates to that GSP Plus arrangement. And later in March, There will be a monitoring mission which will come to Pakistan to have a look in detail at how it is functioning. All of these agreements result, as I've said, usually in formal annual dialogues. We have about 60 different formal dialogues, human rights dialogues with countries and regions in the world. Some of them are with regional organizations like the African Union. Here in Pakistan, it is in the forum of a subgroup of the EU-Pakistan Joint Committee. There is a subgroup on democracy, governance and human rights. It held its last meeting in June, and that group meets every year. In addition to those formal arrangements, our delegations and the member states' embassies in individual countries have dedicated human rights officers who talk regularly with the governments of their host countries about human rights issues, sometimes raising individual cases, sometimes talking about the implementation of existing legislation or the promise of new legislation, sometimes doing things like observing trials or meeting with civil society organizations. And then there's my role, which is a kind of a backup to all of that. I sometimes say that if it was football, I would be the sweeper. My role principally is to engage more in the political side of the work, to meet with governments and to meet with ministers and to participate in multilateral events in relation to human rights issues. All of the engagements that we have with countries outside of the European Union are conducted on the basis of partnership and respect. Sometimes I hear people in Europe refer to the human rights and the contents of our treaties as European values. And they're not European values. They're universal values. And the European Union happens to support them and to support them very strongly. And indeed, I think in our engagement with countries outside the European Union, I think it is also important that we are cognizant of the troubled history of the European continent in relation to human rights issues, and to approach all of our discussions around the world with a degree of humility. And insofar as we can make a contribution to the human rights landscape of today, it is based on the journey that the European Union has travelled and that European Union member states have travelled, and to be willing to share that experience and to share that journey with our friends and partners around the world in the hope that that shared experience and the learning that we also get from the engagement will improve human rights for people everywhere. And we do that because, as I said, we take the view that human rights are universal. They don't belong, they're not the property of any state, any group of states. They don't belong to any political system. They belong to people, and they belong to people everywhere and in every country of the world. That's why we say that they are universal and indivisible. It's also why we believe it is important to pursue those objectives through the multilateral system. In particular, we support the United Nations system, the Human Rights Council, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and the Special Procedures. This year, for the first time, we commenced a formal strategic dialogue with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which I have the honour of co-chairing along with High Commissioner Bashir. We support, as I said, the special procedures to monitor, to investigate and to report on human rights in different countries around the world, and we encourage countries everywhere to cooperate with those special procedures. We often lead on country-specific and on thematic issues at the Human Rights Council and at the General Assembly in New York. Next week, the 49th session of the Human Rights Council will commence in Geneva. We have a resolution on Myanmar, 1 year after the military takeover of that country and the ignoring of the democratic will of the people of Myanmar, in which we will once again highlight the plight and the situation of the Rohingya people. We will have a resolution on the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, closed country where there are serious human rights abuses. We'll have a resolution on Belarus, where there are over 1,000 political prisoners and who are in prison for no reason other than that they questioned or dared to question the result of the elections. There will be a resolution on freedom of religion and belief, and indeed I had the privilege of participating only last week in the meeting of the Istanbul process, which was hosted by Pakistan, and we will have also a resolution on the rights of the child. We will be following up on our resolution on Afghanistan, which called for the appointment of a special rapporteur for Afghanistan, and we hope that that special rapporteur will be appointed before the end of this session of the Human Rights Council, and then we will be seeking ways in which to cooperate with the special rapporteur and to ensure that he or she is able to do the work effectively. We will be giving attention to Ethiopia because of the situation that is developing there, and of course we are paying attention also to issues of our contemporary era, situation, freedom of press, freedom of expression, freedom for journalists and safety for journalists in the modern world. The issue of technology that I've already referred to, on which incidentally we are also doing some work in the domestic policy of the European Union, preparing a new Digital Services Act. We have also been doing some work on how to address issues such as hate speech and some of the vile content which is appearing online in different platforms. And just a couple of years ago we agreed a code of conduct with the social media companies, which they're largely complying with, but we'd like to develop on that through some legislative measures in the Digital Services Act. Business and human rights, which is an increasing area of interest, and again we are preparing some domestic EU legislation which will put a requirement on European companies functioning within the European Union to carry out due diligence in relation to human rights in their supply chains. That legislation is being discussed and being worked on at the moment by the European Commission. But we don't just talk, we don't just do resolutions and make statements, we also back it up with firm action. We back it up with money. We have what we call the Global Human Rights and Democracy Programme, recently launched for the period 2021 to 2027, which provides for a fund of 1.5 billion euros over that period to promote human rights and democracy in the world. How do we spend that? We spend some of that in supporting the various programs of the United Nations and its different agencies. We do it by providing support to human rights defenders. Over the last 5 years, we provided support to about 50,000 human rights defenders in different parts of the world. Some of that support is in the form of emergency grants when it's necessary for a human rights defender to be taken out of a country because of risks that they are facing. Some of the money goes to election observation missions. Over the last 5 years, we have conducted election observation missions in over 100 elections around the world. One of them was in Pakistan in 2018. The normal format is that there is an election observation mission headed by a member of the European Parliament. It looks at what is happening in the election, produces a report which is publicly available, and then it follows up on that to have further discussions with the government of the country about what has happened to the recommendations. And the election observation mission, which was here in 2018, of the chairperson of the chief observer of that mission, will be visiting Pakistan in the next couple of months to conduct the follow-up mission to follow up on what has happened to the recommendations. On top of that, we also have programs on specific areas of human rights. One particular one is what we call the Spotlight Program, which is aimed at addressing violence against women. A fund of about 500 million euros for for various programs around the world. And of course, on top of that are the various bilateral programs of the individual member states. Recently, we also adopted a global human rights sanctions regime for gross violations of human rights. And among the early sanctions that we imposed under that regime were sanctions on some Chinese officials in respect of the treatment of the Uyghur community in Xinjiang. We also have country-specific sanctions regimes. They include the sanctions regime that we have on Myanmar, the sanctions regime that we have on Belarus, and as you will have seen yesterday, the sanctions regime that we have on Russia, and on which we made decisions yesterday to increase significantly the number of officials and entities that are covered by those sanctions. The work that I do, as I said, is mainly political engagement. I chair some of the human rights dialogues. I speak for the European Union at various multilateral events. Next week, for example, in the Human Rights Council, I will be participating on events and debates on the rights of the child, on Belarus and on Ukraine. And I also conduct country visits, where I go to countries, do a visit like I am doing here this week, talk to ministers, talk to civil society, talk with members of the diplomatic community. First of all, to inform myself about, in greater depth about the human rights situation in the country, but also to talk about the follow-up and the implementation of our action plan. Sometimes to talk, as I have been doing this week, about some of the expectations that we have for Pakistan in relation to GSP+. Here I was able to underline the importance of human rights in the EU-Pakistan relations, referring indeed to the continuous, frank and constructive discussions that we have with this country, including the subgroup on democracy, governance and rule of law that I have already mentioned. Welcoming the legislation that the government has introduced in some important areas related to human rights. Also expressing some disappointment at the speed with which some legislation is not happening, referring in particular to legislative initiatives on disappearances, anti-torture legislation, journalist welfare, and on the reduction of crimes for the death penalty. And indeed on that point, I am very encouraged that there has not been any executions in Pakistan for a number of years. I had the opportunity of welcoming the National Commission for Human Rights and its reappointment, the National Commission on the Status of Women, and expressing the hope that those bodies, important bodies, will be adequately resourced to carry out the work that they need to do. Welcoming also the legislative progress made on the protection and harassment of women in the workplace, and landmark judgments regarding juvenile offenders and mentally ill people in relation to the death penalty. But I've also been highlighting some areas of concern. The bills, as I've said, that are still pending in the Parliament, including the one on enforced disappearances and the bill on torture. There are challenges in relation to access to justice. Many cases pending in the courts for many years. One particular case, the case of the Professor Hafiz, who is now in prison for almost 9 years, going on 9 years. He had to be brought to trial to determine his innocence or guilt. That would be 9 years, is almost a full life sentence in many of the member states of the European Union, and that's for somebody who has been convicted. I've been talking about the safety of journalists, issues relating to religious minorities, and also about labour rights. A number of people who are not yet receiving minimum wage, issues relating to contracts of employment for many of the people indeed who work in the industries that benefit from the GSP trade preferences, and the relative lack of inspections in the factory system. It is a discussion, no doubt, that will continue. It's a discussion that I am looking forward to continuing. And it's a discussion that I believe will continue because I know that Pakistan is a country that is committed to human rights. When I was here on Sunday, and the ambassador was taking me around some of the sites of the city, I was struck by the quotations on the wall of the museum from the founder of this state, Jim. And many of the quotations that I saw on the wall in relation to human rights, rights of women, rights of minorities, could have been lifted straight out of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which of course both were written, both appeared in and around the same time. So it does strike me that in very many ways we are on the same page. Sometimes we don't always see it or recognize it, and I think that the work that we have to do, and certainly I consider it part of my work, is to find the common page and to make common cause in advancing the cause of human rights and the centrality of human rights, not only in the foreign policy of the European Union, but in the engagements that we have and the friendships that we have with countries all over the world, and especially the friendship we have with Pakistan. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for the insightful talk. Ladies and gentlemen, the floor is now open for a question and answer session. The Q&A session will be moderated by Chair Ambassador Chaudhry, Director General of SSI.
What a scintillating talk, very clear and very interesting, I must say. And as you would know, we have recorded this and we will be placing it on the YouTube and on social media, because the rest of Pakistan who are not here, they should be able to listen to what you have to say. And I think the subject you have chosen was very, very interesting, centrality of human rights in the EU foreign policy, and I was particularly struck by the example you gave that EU mentions human rights in every trade engagement, even with countries like Canada, and that's what the example that you gave. And that shows, and it is not surprising for anyone who has studied the European history. They have learned this lesson after bitter past, where world wars were fought, blood was shed. And no wonder that when the United Nations was created, one of the first major document was Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948, to which you referred while referring to the statement by Muhammad Ali Jinnah. So it was very, very interesting talk by you, and I know that your colleague, Pastor Kaminana, has also been very, very active in Pakistan, promoting the messages that come from Europe. In Pakistan, there has been a gradual consciousness to observe human rights not only at the national level but also by adapting the international covenants onto our national laws. And I'm very happy that our country is participating actively in the United Nations Human Rights Council's UPRs, Universal Periodic Reviews. In fact, I participated at least in 2 of them, and in 2008, 2012, and 2017, I don't know which one is the latest that our country has gone into. But these are all happy signs and healthy signs. But there's still a lot. There's still a lot that needs to be done in our country on human rights, and that's why every visitor like you is a reminder to us that considerable ground still remains to be covered. What we have done is that I had asked the researchers to jot down the questions if they have. And if anyone sitting here wants to ask a question, please put it on the paper, give it to my colleagues on the side, and they'll bring it to me. And we also have limitation of time, so the question answer session will be essentially only for 15 minutes, because the gentleman has to leave at 5:15 sharp for his next appointment. Now, the first question that actually is lurking in my mind also, and I'm sure it's somewhere in these questions also. What the people of Pakistan get perturbed are the double standards in human rights. And they see, and it's not only European Union, I mean worldwide, we see that, that although there should be universal human rights, and yet we feel that the people of Pakistan are looking at the atrocities and gross human rights violations of the people of occupied Kashmir, Indian occupied Kashmir. And that really has reached a proportion where even the Genocide Watch, Human Rights Watch, and Amnesty International have spoken, US legislators have held hearings on them, UK legislators have spoken, UN Human Rights Council has issued 2 reports on this. But we don't hear that much from European Union on that. Sometimes we get a feeling that perhaps political expediencies trump human rights considerations. Would you like to make any comment on that?
Well, first of all, let me say in general, first of all, that no country in the world has a perfect human rights record. And that includes countries in the European Union. So as you said in the introduction to the question, I think that the accusation of double standards can, is one I think that can be thrown around, or can be, the accusation that can be made more broadly. As I said, we have, in any country that we have a relationship with, human rights is part of that. And that includes India. One of the things that I was disappointed with was the human rights dialogue with India. European Union human rights dialogue with India had really been in abeyance for about 7 years until last year, and I'm glad to say that we have managed to reinstate that, so we now have a regular human rights dialogue with India. I have discussed with interlocutors in India the situation in Kashmir and the concerns that we have about the human rights situation in Kashmir. I haven't discussed it on the public airways, but I have discussed it with Indian interlocutors. We have, as a European Union, taken the view that the situation in Kashmir is one that, in our view, should be discussed bilaterally by Pakistan and India, and one also discussion that should involve the people of Kashmir. As a European Union, we are willing to help in that process in any way we can. Obviously, it would require being invited, and we would have to consider what role we could play in that area. And in relation to human rights violations within Kashmir, as I said in my statement earlier, we support the special procedures of the United Nations, and we feel that the special procedures of the United Nations should be invited by both countries to look at the human rights situation in Kashmir. So that's where we stand.
Thank you. Another question here is that there are several reports on the incidents of violence and serious human rights violations against refugees and migrants at various European borders, several of which have resulted in tragic loss of life. Any comments on that?
Yes, indeed. Refugees and migrants, I think, everywhere should be treated with respect and with dignity to which they're entitled. And unfortunately, there are many cases, and they're not all in Europe, where that does not take place. We had incidents, for example, on the Belarus-Polish border and the Belarus-Lithuania border in recent times. Those were circumstances where the unfortunate migrants from different conflict-afflicted areas in the world, particularly in the Middle East, were brought to that border by the Belarusian authorities in an attempt, if you like, to get up the nose of the European Union and European Union member states in response to the sanctions that were imposed on the Lukashenko regime. That was scandalous instrumentalizing of those migrants. I appreciate there are issues been raised with this by many people about how the situation of those migrants were treated. Some of those appeared on television and the pushback, if you like, on migrants. What didn't unfortunately appear as much on television was the enormous generosity of many Polish citizens, and Lithuanian citizens, and citizens of other countries where those migrants were coming across and welcomed to Berlin. We're often asked about the situation in the Mediterranean, and there are issues that have to be addressed and are being addressed in relation to the Mediterranean. But again, I think we have to put into perspective the more than 700,000 migrants who were rescued, whose lives were saved in the Mediterranean by the operation of the naval operation of several EU member states. I'm very conscious of these issues, and in fact, I welcome it when issues like this and other issues within the European Union are raised with me, either in human rights dialogues by countries or indeed at public events like this, because anywhere in the world where we see that there are human rights issues, I think we should call on it. I welcome it, and we welcome it, that we are reminded of our obligations, and of course we would hope that when we draw attention to some human rights issue in some country, that it would be received and addressed in the same way.
Thank you. Thank you. This is a question sent to me by Zaman Bajwa. India is second largest trading partner of EU after China. 27 conventions of human rights bind the trading partners of EU to protect human rights. India is violating all 13 clauses of EU HR policy in the Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir. What is your take on this? I think you have addressed that, because you said that you were talking to the Indians, though not in public but privately, but India has not been engaging in that for several years in the human rights dialogue. Then there is a question, do you believe that there is a growing politicization of human rights throughout the globe? I think that also you, in a way, addressed that everywhere there is some kind of double standard that you see, there is some kind of politicization which you have experienced. It's a fight that we are all in it together, I guess. I think Pakistan has done fairly well in implementing human rights obligations. What scenario do you foresee for Pakistan GSP Plus status, which is up for review next year?
Okay, let me take that one. Well, I think probably the most significant message this week that I've been seeking to convey to the government of Pakistan is that the game is changing on GSP Plus. Up to now, GSP Plus is in place. There's a regular monitoring mission from the European Commission various things are looked at, boxes are ticked, is this being done, is that being done, and generally speaking what happens, GSP Plus continues unless at some point the whistle is blown on it and it's withdrawn or partially withdrawn or whatever. That approach to it will apply to the end of 2023, and then it will change. And what will change is that there will be a requirement of countries that benefit from GSP Plus to reapply for GSP Plus. And that reapplication will have to be considered not only by the Commission officials who are currently dealing with the GSP Plus, but also will have to be considered by the Council representing the 27 member states and by the European Parliament. And therefore, the bar, if you like, is set. There is a step change in the way in which GSP Plus. What I've been trying to do this week is to, first of all, draw attention to this change in how it's going to work, identify the areas which I think need to be addressed if an application from Pakistan for renewal of GSP Plus is to be successful, and to offer, obviously, to work with Pakistan in how those what needs to be done is done, and done in good time, because time passes and some of the things need to be either done or certainly set in motion rather than left until the last minute.
Thank you. And one final question, and then we'll close the meeting. You mentioned human rights related sanctions. There has been a debate that while sanctions do influence the behavior of the governments of the state, but they also end up punishing the very people of the state whom you are trying to protect. So in a way, the sanctions end up violating the very basic human rights of the people. How has the European Union resolved this dilemma, if I may use that word?
I think that's a really, really important point, and we have been careful in the way we operate the sanctions to target them at the violators of human rights, rather than to apply sanctions generally to a population. So we have tended not to do general economic sanctions. We have tended to focus sanctions on individuals and entities that are associated with the perpetrators of human rights violations. I think the second point is that we don't see sanctions as the sole tool in relation to it's an important one, of course, but I think it is also important to read the sanctions in conjunction with the more positive encouragement that we try to give to countries and to encourage them. I should say also in the context of conflict that we are very strong supporters of the International Criminal Court and of international humanitarian law and of accountability mechanisms for human rights violations. And while we have imposed sanctions on several, there's more than 200 I think now, in Belarus, we're also supporting the establishment of an accountability platform for that country, as we have been, for example, in relation to Myanmar for accountability for what happened to the Rohingya. Because I think one of the messages that is important to get out, particularly to those gross violations, and particularly gross violations of international humanitarian law, where we're talking about effectively war crimes, there needs to be an end to impunity and a sense that the era of impunity is over. And that however long it may take, and if you look at, for example, the situation in the Balkans, where it took 20 years for some of the perpetrators to eventually be brought to the Hague and to account for themselves, the message that perpetrators will have to stand in a courtroom somewhere and account for what they have done. That is a message that needs to get out there. So it's a mix of measures, a mix in the toolbox, and using sanctions, I think, in a selective way, and not always rushing to the sanctions toolbox when there's an issue to be addressed. And sometimes we're asked, sometimes we're put under a bit of pressure. If there's a human rights crisis somewhere, we must impose sanctions. We don't always reach for for sanctions. We try and see if there are other ways that we can encourage improvement. May I say, just in finality, that the couple of questions that you did draw to my attention, which mentioned some specific issues, I'll be very happy if the questioners obviously have answered. If the questioners want to send me that information or send me the details of conventions that are not applicable, I'm very happy to have a look at those. I don't want anybody who asked a question and wasn't answered to feel that I'm skipping over. Very happy to take that information and to take it.
Thank you. Mr. Kaminala, do you want to add anything? No? Okay, good. Well, then please join me in giving a hand of applause for
Ambassador Khalid Mahmood, Chairman, BOG ISSI, to present Institute's shield to our guest speaker. I request our guest speaker, Director General ISSI and Ambassador Kaminala, to please join Ambassador Mahmood in front of the stage. This will be followed by a group conversation with our guest speaker.
The center that hosted you wants to be.
Of course.